Hey guys, tonight we begin a journey into the shadows of medieval Europe, where beauty wasn't just skin deep, it was deadly. Picture this: a noble woman in 14th century France, her face so white it glows like moonlight, her skin so pale you can see the blue veins beneath. She's stunning, and she's slowly dying from lead poisoning. Every morning, she paints her face with a mixture that contains more toxic metals than a modern car battery. Why? Because in medieval Europe, looking like a beautiful corpse wasn't just fashionable, it was the ultimate status symbol. Tonight, we're uncovering the shocking truth about medieval beauty standards that literally killed for perfection. Before we dive into this haunting tale together, I'd love for you to join our community of history lovers. If you're ready to explore the darker side of beauty with me, hit that subscribe button and give this video a like, but only if it genuinely captivates you. I'm curious. Are you watching this from your cozy bedroom, maybe with a cup of tea? Or perhaps you're listening while taking a late-night walk? Drop a comment and let me know where this story finds you tonight. Now, dim those lights, get comfortable, and let's step back in time to discover why medieval women chose poison over sunshine. Close your eyes for a moment and imagine walking through the grand halls of a medieval castle. The year is 1350, and you're attending a feast at the court of King Edward III of England. As you enter the great hall, candlelight flickers across dozens of faces, but something seems off. Every woman looks ghostly pale, almost translucent, as if they've never seen sunlight in their entire lives. And the truth is, many of them haven't, at least not by choice. You see, in medieval Europe, pale skin wasn't just beautiful, it was a billboard advertising your social status. According to historical records from the time, including the writings of Christine de Pizan in her 1405 work, The Book of the City of Ladies, a lady's worth was quite literally measured by how white her skin appeared. The paler you were, the more obvious it became that you didn't need to work in the fields under the scorching sun like a peasant. But here's where it gets fascinating and terrifying. Medieval women didn't just avoid the sun. They actively pursued a deathly pallor through methods that would make modern beauty influencers run screaming. They used a foundation called ceruse, a mixture of white lead and vinegar that gave them that coveted porcelain complexion. Historical accounts from the court of Isabella of France describe how ladies would apply this toxic paste so thickly that their faces looked like marble sculptures. The recipe for this deadly beauty treatment, documented in manuscripts from the Abbey of Saint-Denis, included not just lead but also crushed pearls, eggshells, and sometimes even arsenic for that extra glow. Can you imagine? These women were literally painting heavy metals onto their skin day after day, year after year. And the effects? Well, they weren't exactly what you'd call beauty benefits. The lead slowly seeped into their bloodstreams, causing what medieval physicians called the painter's colic, excruciating stomach cramps, paralysis, and eventually death. Marie de Medici, wife of King Henry IV of France, was known for her stunning white complexion and her mysterious illnesses that modern doctors now recognize as classic symptoms of lead poisoning. But wait, it gets even more extreme. Some medieval beauties took bloodletting to achieve that perfect pale look. That's right. They would literally drain blood from their bodies to appear more ethereal. Manuscripts from the medical school of Salerno describe how noble ladies would have physicians draw blood from their arms and faces, believing it would give them that coveted translucent appearance. The irony is almost poetic, isn't it? These women were so desperate to look like they'd never worked a day in their lives that they were willing to slowly kill themselves with their beauty routine. Think about that for a moment. In our modern world, we spend billions on products promising to give us a healthy glow, while medieval women spent fortunes to look like beautiful ghosts. Here's something that might surprise you. This obsession with deathly pale skin was so extreme that some women would paint blue veins onto their temples and wrists to emphasize their translucency. Court records from the Burgundian court mention ladies using a mixture of blue pigment and egg whites to draw fake veins, making themselves appear even more delicate and otherworldly. The psychological impact of these beauty standards was devastating. Young girls as early as 12 years old would begin the ceruse treatments, according to the household accounts from noble families. Can you imagine being a teenager and already poisoning yourself for beauty? The pressure was so intense that refusing to whiten your skin was seen as a rejection of your noble birth. And here's a detail that always makes me pause. Medieval mirrors were made of polished metal, not glass, which means these women never got a clear view of what they actually looked like. They were literally dying for a beauty standard they could barely even see clearly. It's both tragic and absurd when you think about it. The church played a complicated role in this deadly beauty trend. While some religious texts condemned vanity, others actually encouraged the pale look, associating it with purity and virtue. The Virgin Mary was always depicted with snow-white skin in medieval art, reinforcing the idea that pale meant holy, while darker skin was associated with sin and labour. But perhaps the most haunting part of this story is how normalised it all was. Death from cosmetics was so common that medieval wills often included specific instructions about beauty supplies. The will of Margaret of Anjou, dated 1482, actually bequeaths her collection of face paints and whitening powders to her daughter, like a deadly family heirloom. So what does this tell us about human nature? Here were intelligent, powerful women queens, duchesses, influential nobles, who chose to slowly poison themselves rather than challenge a beauty standard. It makes you wonder, what are we doing to ourselves today, in the name of beauty, that future generations will look back on in horror? The medieval obsession with pale skin eventually faded, but it didn't disappear overnight. It took centuries, and ironically, it was often replaced by equally dangerous beauty trends. Which brings us to our next chapter in this dark history of beauty, because if you think the pale skin obsession was extreme, wait until you hear about what medieval women did to their foreheads. Speaking of foreheads, imagine for a moment that you woke up this morning and decided your hairline was at least 3 inches too low. So you grabbed some tweezers and spent the next 4 hours plucking every single hair from your forehead until you looked like you had a receding hairline. Sounds crazy, right? Well, in medieval Europe, this wasn't just normal. It was the height of sophistication. Welcome to the world of medieval forehead fashion, where bigger was always better, and women literally reshaped their skulls in the name of beauty. Now, before you think I'm exaggerating, let me paint you a picture. It's 1410, and you're strolling through the bustling streets of Paris. Every fashionable woman you pass has what can only be described as a 5-head or maybe even a 6-head. Their hairline starts so far back that they look like they're permanently surprised. And they are absolutely stunning by medieval standards. This wasn't some accident of genetics, my friends. According to the detailed household accounts of Marguerite of Burgundy, documented in the Archives nationales de France, noble ladies employed specialized servants called pluqueuresses, professional hair pluckers whose entire job was to maintain their mistress's artificially high hairline. Can you imagine putting that on your medieval resume? Seeking employment as a professional forehead hair remover. The process was as painful as it sounds. Historical records from the court of Anne of Brittany describe women spending up to 6 hours at a time having their hairlines plucked, often while reciting prayers or listening to music to distract from the agony. The Italian physician Taddeo Alderotti wrote in his 1295 medical treatise that he regularly treated noble ladies for infections and scarring caused by overzealous hair plucking. But here's what's truly fascinating. This wasn't just about fashion. The high forehead was considered a sign of intelligence and noble breeding. Medieval physiognomy texts, including those by Michael Scott in his Liber Physiognomiae from 1228, explicitly stated that a high, broad forehead indicated superior intellect and noble character. The logic was beautifully twisted. If you could afford to spend hours painfully plucking your hairline, you clearly had both the wealth and the refined sensibilities of the upper class. Think about that for a second. These women were literally reshaping their faces to advertise their intelligence. It's like getting a PhD tattooed on your forehead, except infinitely more painful and requiring daily maintenance. The tools used for this beauty ritual would make a modern esthetician faint. According to inventory records from the Chateau de Vincennes, the forehead plucking kit of Queen Isabeau of Bavaria included silver tweezers, bone needles, and something called plucking paste, a mixture of resin and lime that was supposed to make hair removal easier, but often left permanent scars. And just when you think it couldn't get more extreme, some women took it a step further. They would use caustic substances to permanently destroy hair follicles. The recipe books of medieval apothecaries preserved in manuscripts at the Bibliothèque Nationale include formulations containing lye, quicklime, and even cat's blood, yes. You heard that right, to create permanent hair removal solutions. Here's where it gets almost comically tragic. The plucking didn't stop at the hairline. Oh no, that was just the beginning. Fashion-conscious medieval ladies also plucked their eyebrows into thin, barely there lines, often removing them entirely. Portrait analysis from the workshop of Jan van Eyck shows that the ideal medieval woman had essentially no visible eyebrows at all. The psychological pressure to maintain this look was enormous. The Burgundian court chronicler Georges Chastelain wrote in 1461 about young noblewomen who would rise at dawn to begin their plucking routine, often crying from pain but never stopping because appearing with a natural hairline would be social suicide. But perhaps the most heartbreaking detail comes from the personal letters of Margaret of York, preserved in the British Library. She wrote to her sister in 1470, describing how her forehead plucking had become so severe that she could no longer wear certain headdresses because the scabs and infections were visible. Yet she continued the practice because, in her words, to appear with the forehead of a peasant would bring dishonour to our family name. The irony is absolutely stunning. These were some of the most powerful women in Europe, queens, duchesses, women who controlled vast territories and influenced international politics, and they were spending hours each day in excruciating pain to remove hair from their faces. They were literally torturing themselves to look smart. And here's a detail that always amazes me. The artificial hairlines weren't even consistent. Fashion changed every few decades. Court records show that in the early 1300s, the ideal forehead was about 2 finger widths high. By 1400 it had grown to 4 finger widths. By 1450 some women were plucking so far back that their hairlines nearly reached the tops of their heads. Can you imagine being a teenage girl in this era? Your entire social future depended on how willing you were to endure daily torture to reshape your skull. The coming-of-age ceremonies for noble girls often included their first professional forehead plucking, marking their transition from childhood to marriageable young woman. The economic impact of the beauty standard was staggering. Account books from the household of Eleanor of Aquitaine show that the annual cost of maintaining a fashionable forehead, including the plukeress's salary, special tools and medicinal treatments for infections, was equivalent to about 3 months' wages for a skilled craftsman. But here's what really gets me. This wasn't a beauty trend that lasted a few years. We're talking about centuries of self-imposed cranial torture, generation after generation of intelligent, capable women who could have been discussing philosophy or running kingdoms instead, spent their mornings having their faces methodically depulucked. The medical consequences were severe and well documented. Medieval medical texts describe a condition called forehead fever, chronic infections from over-plucking that could lead to permanent scarring and hair loss. Some women became so dependent on the plucking routine that they developed what we would now recognize as a form of trichotillomania, compulsively removing hair even when it caused bleeding and infection. And yet somehow this was all considered worth it for intelligence. The twisted logic was that if you could afford to waste time on such elaborate beauty routines, you must be smart enough to have accumulated the wealth necessary to do so. It's like a medieval version of conspicuous consumption, except instead of buying expensive cars, you were buying expensive pain. The end of the high forehead trend came gradually, and rather ironically, it was often replaced by equally extreme beauty practices. As we'll discover next, while some medieval women were destroying their hairlines in the name of intelligence, others were doing something equally shocking to their eyebrows. And trust me, what they did to achieve the perfect medieval brow will make the forehead plucking seem almost reasonable. Now here's something that would absolutely blow your mind. While modern women spend billions of dollars every year getting their unibrows lasered, waxed and plucked apart, medieval women were doing the exact opposite. They were actually drawing fake unibrows onto their faces. Yes, you heard that correctly. In certain parts of medieval Europe, having one continuous eyebrow stretching across your entire forehead wasn't just acceptable, it was the ultimate beauty goal. Picture this, you're attending a wedding feast in 13th century Byzantium, and as you scan the room, every single beautiful woman looks like she stepped out of a Frida Kahlo painting. Their eyebrows meet in the middle, creating one bold, dramatic line across their foreheads. And they've spent hours perfecting this look. The unibrow trend was particularly powerful in the Byzantine Empire and parts of medieval Persia, where it carried deep cultural significance. According to the writings of Anna Komnenos in her historical work The Alexiad, completed around 1148, the monobrow was considered a sign of intelligence, passion, and fertility. Byzantine women who were naturally blessed with connected eyebrows were literally seen as gifts from heaven. But here's where it gets fascinating. For women who weren't born with this blessing, there was an entire industry built around creating fake unibrows. Medieval beauty manuals, including the Taqwim al-Siha by Ibn Butlan from 1068, contain detailed recipes for unibrow enhancement. The most popular method involved mixing antimony powder with goat's hair and egg whites to create a paste that could be painted between the eyebrows. The process was surprisingly sophisticated. Court records from the palace of the Porphyrogenitus in Constantinople describe professional brow artists who would carefully measure the distance between a woman's natural eyebrows and create the perfect bridge. The ideal unibrow had to be precisely proportioned, too thick and you looked like a man, too thin and you looked incomplete. Can you imagine the morning routine? While we're complaining about spending 10 minutes on our eyebrows, Byzantine ladies were dedicating an hour or more to perfecting their monobrow. The application process, as described in the medical treatises of Etius of Amida, required steady hands and incredible patience. One wrong stroke and you'd have to start over completely. Here's what makes this even more intriguing. The unibrow wasn't just about beauty, it was deeply connected to superstition and spirituality. Medieval Persian texts, including those found in the manuscripts at the Chester Beatty Library, suggest that women with connected eyebrows were believed to possess the evil eye, a protective power that could ward off bad luck and jealous spirits. The religious implications were complex and often contradictory. While some Christian texts condemned artificial beauty enhancements, Byzantine religious art frequently depicted the Virgin Mary and female saints with pronounced unibrows. The 11th century mosaics in Ravenna's Basilica of San Vitale show Empress Theodora with a clearly defined monobrow, suggesting that even the most sacred figures embodied this beauty ideal. But the most shocking part, the ingredients used to create these fake unibrows were often dangerous. Archaeological evidence from medieval burial sites in Anatolia shows high levels of lead and mercury in the skull areas of noble women, likely from years of applying toxic eyebrow cosmetics. The coal used to darken and connect eyebrows contained antimony sulfide, which could cause severe eye infections and even blindness with prolonged use. The economic impact was substantial. Trade records from medieval Constantinople show that antimony and specialized eyebrow tools were among the most expensive beauty imports. A set of professional unibrow drawing implements could cost more than a skilled craftsman's monthly wages. Yet women continued to invest in these tools because appearing without a monobrow in certain social circles was simply not an option. Here's a detail that always strikes me as both tragic and absurd. Young girls as early as age 10 would begin training to draw perfect unibrows. The Byzantine princess Anna de Lassinus wrote in her personal diary, preserved in the Marciana Library in Venice, about practicing her unibrow technique for hours each day, often until her eyes watered from the concentrated antimony fumes. The peer pressure was intense. Court chronicles from the reign of Basil Luca describe how women who appeared in public with separated eyebrows were often mocked and excluded from social gatherings. The monobrow became such a status symbol that some women would actually tattoo permanent lines between their eyebrows rather than risk a smudged or uneven daily application. But perhaps the most fascinating aspect was the regional variation. While Byzantine women preferred thick, bold unibrows, Persian court ladies opted for thinner, more delicate bridges. The medieval travel writer Ibn Battuta noted in his chronicles from 1354 that he could identify a woman's social class and region of origin simply by examining the style of her monobrow. The medical consequences were surprisingly well documented. The physician Rhazes, in his 10th century medical compendium Al-Hawi, described a condition he called brow fever, chronic inflammation and infection caused by daily application of toxic cosmetics to the sensitive skin between the eyebrows. Yet women continued the practice because the social benefits outweighed the physical risks. And here's something that might surprise you. The unibrow trend lasted for centuries in some regions. While Western Europe moved away from the monobrow by the late medieval period, parts of the Byzantine Empire and Persia maintained this beauty standard well into the Renaissance era. Some isolated communities in the Caucasus Mountains reportedly continued the practice until the 18th century. The psychological impact was profound. Women who couldn't achieve the perfect unibrow often developed what medieval physicians called melancholia of the brow, a form of depression specifically related to eyebrow inadequacy. The 12th century physician Maimonides wrote about treating noble women who had become reclusive because they felt their natural eyebrows brought shame to their families. Think about the irony here. These were often brilliant, powerful women empresses, scholars, wealthy merchants who controlled vast resources and influenced political decisions. Yet they believed that their worth as human beings was fundamentally tied to whether they could successfully connect two patches of hair above their eyes. The tools used for unibrow creation were surprisingly sophisticated. Archaeological excavations at medieval Trebizond have uncovered ivory combs specifically designed for grooming monobrows, silver applicators for precise cosmetic placement, and even tiny mirrors crafted specifically for eyebrow work. These weren't crude beauty hacks. This was a refined art form with specialized equipment. What's particularly striking is how this beauty standard reflected deeper cultural values. In societies where the unibrow was prized, There was often a corresponding belief in the importance of physical completeness and symmetry. The connected eyebrow symbolized unity, wholeness, and divine perfection. Breaking that line was seen as breaking the natural harmony of the face. Yet as powerful as this trend was, it eventually gave way to new beauty obsessions that were equally extreme. While some medieval women were perfecting their monobrows, others were pursuing an entirely different aesthetic one that would make the unibrow seem positively subtle by comparison. Because if you think drawing fake eyebrows was dramatic, wait until you discover what medieval beauties were willing to do to achieve the ultimate deathly glamour. If you thought the beauty standards we've explored so far were extreme, what I'm about to tell you will completely redefine your understanding of medieval glamour. Imagine walking into a grand cathedral in 1480, and instead of seeing the rosy-cheeked, vibrant faces you might expect, you're confronted with an entire congregation of women who look like they've just emerged from their tombs. Hollow cheeks, sunken eyes, skin so pale it's almost grey, and an otherworldly gauntness that would make today's most dedicated goth enthusiasts look positively healthy. This wasn't the result of illness or poverty. This was the pinnacle of medieval beauty. Welcome to the era when looking like a beautiful corpse wasn't just fashionable, it was absolutely essential for social survival. The corpse bride aesthetic wasn't some fringe movement or brief trend. According to the detailed court records preserved in the Vatican secret archives, this deathly beauty ideal dominated European high society from roughly 1400 to 1520. The look was so pervasive that the Florentine merchant Giovanni Rucellai wrote in his personal diary in 1457 that a woman who appeared too alive at court functions was considered vulgar and inappropriate for polite company. But here's what's truly mind-boggling. Achieving this corpse-like appearance required a level of dedication that bordered on the masochistic. The process began with what medieval beauty manuals called the Great Emptying. Women would deliberately starve themselves to achieve that coveted hollow-cheeked skeletal appearance. The Livre de la Chasse by Gaston III de Foix, while primarily a hunting manual, contains detailed marginalia describing how noble ladies would consume nothing but watered wine and communion wafers for weeks at a time to achieve the perfect gaunt look. The fasting wasn't just about weight loss. It was about achieving a specific type of physical deterioration that mimicked the early stages of consumption. Medieval physicians like Bartolomeo Platina wrote in his 1474 treatise De Honesta Voluptate about treating noble women for what he called voluntary wasting disease. Essentially, self-induced malnutrition pursued for aesthetic reasons. Now, if you're thinking this sounds like medieval anorexia, you're not entirely wrong. But the motivations were fascinatingly different from modern eating disorders. This wasn't about control or self-punishment. It was about achieving a very specific spiritual and aesthetic ideal. The hollow, ethereal look was believed to make women appear more angelic, more connected to the divine realm than the earthly one. The tools and techniques used to enhance this deathly appearance were absolutely ingenious in their morbidity. Court inventory records from the palace of the Dukes of Burgundy list items like shadow powders, made from crushed charcoal and bat wings, specifically designed to create artificial dark circles under the eyes. Can you imagine putting bat wings on your face? The commitment to this aesthetic was truly extraordinary, but the fasting was just the beginning. To achieve the perfect corpse-like pallor, women would combine their starvation diets with controlled bloodletting. The personal physician to Isabella of Castile, Fernando Alvarez de Toledo, documented in his medical journals how the queen would have exactly 3 ounces of blood drawn from her arms every week to maintain what he called her celestial translucency. Here's where it gets even more extreme. Some women would deliberately expose themselves to certain illnesses to achieve the right look. Historical accounts from the court of Anne of Brittany describe ladies intentionally contracting mild cases of the white fever, likely a form of tuberculosis, because the disease produced exactly the kind of ethereal wasting that was considered beautiful. The psychology behind this trend is absolutely fascinating. According to the writings of Christine de Pizan in her 1405 work, The Treasury of the City of Ladies, the corpse-like appearance was seen as proof of a woman's spiritual refinement. The logic went like they. If you looked too healthy and robust, it suggested you were overly concerned with earthly pleasures like food and physical comfort. But if you appeared to be slowly wasting away, it demonstrated that your soul was so focused on heavenly matters that you barely bothered with worldly sustenance. The religious implications were profound and often contradictory. While the Catholic Church officially condemned vanity and excessive attention to appearance, many religious texts actually praised women who achieved this deathly beauty through fasting and self-denial. The mystic Catherine of Siena, who died in 1380, became a model for this aesthetic. Her extreme fasting and resulting corpse-like appearance were seen as evidence of her holiness. But here's what really gets me: the economic impact of looking like you were dying. Account books from noble households show that maintaining the corpse bride look was incredibly expensive. The specialized cosmetics alone, those shadow powders, the pale foundations made from ground pearls and lead, the lip stains designed to create that perfect bloodless look could cost more than a servant's annual wages. The daily routine was exhaustingly complex. Women would rise before dawn to begin the process of creating their deathly pallor. First came the fasting nothing but perhaps a few sips of wine mixed with rosewater. Then the careful application of white lead foundation, followed by charcoal-based shadows around the eyes, and finally the strategic use of red ochre to create the appearance of fever spots on the cheeks. The social pressure to maintain this look was absolutely crushing. The Burgundian chronicler Olivier de la Marche wrote in his memoirs about witnessing young noblewomen collapsing from hunger during court ceremonies, only to be praised for their dedication to achieving the perfect ethereal appearance. Fainting from starvation wasn't seen as a medical emergency, it was seen as a fashion statement. And the tools! Archaeological excavations at medieval castle sites have uncovered some truly bizarre beauty implements. Silver spoons specifically designed for the controlled vomiting that some women use to maintain their gauntness. Tiny ivory picks for creating artificial lesions on the skin to mimic the marks of holy suffering. Even specialized mirrors with darker glass that made women appear more corpse-like than they actually were. The regional variations were striking. While French and Burgundian courts preferred the full corpse aesthetic, hollow cheeks, sunken eyes, skeletal thinness, Italian nobles often opted for what they called the fever look, which involved the same pale, wasted appearance but with bright, glassy eyes that suggested a more active form of holy suffering. But perhaps the most heartbreaking aspect of this trend was its impact on young women. Girls as young as 12 would begin the starvation regimens necessary to achieve the corpse bride look. The mortality rates among young noblewomen during this period show a suspicious spike in deaths from what medieval physicians called mysterious wasting diseases, likely the result of voluntary starvation pursued for beauty. The irony is absolutely staggering. These were women with access to the finest foods in Europe, the best medical care available, the most comfortable living conditions imaginable. And they were choosing to slowly starve themselves to look like they were dying. It's as if they had everything to live for, but chose to look like they were already dead. Here's a detail that always haunts me. The marriage contracts from this period often included clauses about maintaining the bride's corpse-like appearance. Grooms would literally negotiate for the right to ensure their wives continued the starvation practices necessary to keep them looking appropriately deathly. Love in the age of corpse brides was a very complicated thing. The medical consequences were predictably severe. Court physicians like Michele Savonarola wrote extensively about treating noble ladies for what we would now recognize as severe malnutrition, osteoporosis, and organ failure. Yet these same physicians often prescribed additional fasting as a beauty treatment, creating a deadly cycle of medically sanctioned starvation. What strikes me most about this era is how normalized the suffering became. Women who complained about hunger or weakness were seen as lacking in spiritual refinement. The ability to appear beautiful while slowly dying was considered the highest form of feminine achievement. It was literally a competition to see who could look the most ethereally deceased while still technically being alive. As this corpse bride aesthetic reached its peak, it began to intersect with other equally extreme beauty practices. Because while some medieval women were starving themselves to achieve that perfect deathly pallor, others were focusing on a completely different part of their anatomy, their mouths. And what they were doing to their teeth and lips will make everything we've discussed so far seem almost reasonable. What would you say if I told you that in medieval times, the most beautiful smile was one you never wanted to see? That wealthy noble ladies actually paid small fortunes to make their teeth look rotten, decayed, and absolutely disgusting by our modern standards? You might think I've finally lost my mind, but I assure you, the medieval obsession with deliberately ruining their teeth was very real and very deadly. Prepare yourself for one of the most shocking beauty practices in human history. Let me take you back to the court of Queen Elizabeth in 1588. You're attending a grand feast celebrating the defeat of the Spanish Armada, and as the Queen opens her mouth to speak, you're struck by something horrifying. Her teeth are completely black. Not just stained or yellowed, but coal black, rotting and so decayed that several are missing entirely. And the shocking truth? This wasn't the result of poor dental hygiene. This was the height of fashion. According to the detailed accounts of Spanish ambassador Don Bernardino de Mendoza, preserved in the Archivo General de Simancas, Queen Elizabeth's black teeth were actually a status symbol. The wealthy could afford sugar, a luxury so expensive it cost more than gold, and consuming it regularly enough to rot your teeth became a way to advertise your incredible wealth. It was literally conspicuous consumption taken to its most absurd extreme. But Elizabeth wasn't unique. The trend of deliberately blackened teeth swept through European nobility like a plague of vanity. Court records from the Palace of Versailles show that French nobles would spend enormous sums on what they called sugar paint, a thick syrup made from concentrated sugar and molasses that they would apply to their teeth specifically to accelerate decay and create that coveted black look. Now here's where it gets truly bizarre. Some wealthy women who couldn't afford enough sugar to naturally rot their teeth would fake the look using dangerous cosmetics. The beauty manual Il Libro dell'arte del danzare by Guglielmo Ebreo, written in 1463, contains recipes for tooth blackening compounds made from lamp soot, iron filings, and vinegar. Can you imagine voluntarily painting iron filings onto your teeth? The social psychology behind this trend is absolutely fascinating. In a world where sugar was so rare that most peasants never tasted it in their entire lives, having black, rotted teeth was proof positive that you could afford life's sweetest luxuries. It was the medieval equivalent of driving a Ferrari, except instead of showing off your car, you were showing off your dental decay. But the lengths women went to achieve the perfect rotten smile went far beyond just eating sugar or applying cosmetics. Historical records from the court of Catherine de' Medici describe a procedure called tooth fipple, where court physicians would deliberately file down healthy teeth to create cavities that could then be filled with a black paste made from crushed beetles and tar. The tools used for deliberate tooth destruction were surprisingly sophisticated. Archaeological excavations at the Château de Chambord have uncovered ivory-handled tooth files, silver picks designed for creating artificial cavities, and even tiny hammers specifically crafted for chipping teeth in aesthetically pleasing patterns. This wasn't random destruction, it was carefully orchestrated dental mutilation. Here's a detail that always makes me pause: the pain. These women were enduring excruciating dental agony not because they had to, but because they wanted to. The personal diary of Marie de Rohan, preserved in the Bibliothèque nationale de France, contains entries describing weeks of sleepless nights due to the pain from her deliberately damaged teeth. Yet she continued the practice because appearing with white teeth would have been social suicide. The regional variations were striking and often competitive. While French nobles preferred uniformly black teeth, Italian aristocrats developed a trend for what they called the checkerboard smile, alternating black and white teeth in a pattern that required incredible precision to achieve. The Venetian beauty treatise Ornatus Mulierum by Trotula, dating from the 12th century, contains detailed instructions for creating these decorative dental patterns. But perhaps the most shocking aspect was how this trend affected social interactions. Smiling itself became a complex social ritual. Court etiquette manuals from the era, including Il Galateo by Giovanni della Casa from 1558, contain detailed instructions on how to display your blackened teeth properly. Too wide a smile was considered vulgar, while too narrow a smile failed to adequately showcase your expensive dental decay. The economic impact was staggering. Account books from the household of Anne of Cleves show that maintaining fashionably rotten teeth cost approximately the same as keeping a stable of horses. The sugar alone required to naturally blacken teeth could feed a peasant family for months, while the specialized cosmetics and dental tools represented investments that rivaled the cost of jewelry or fine art. Here's something that might surprise you. The church's response was fascinatingly complex. While some religious leaders condemned the vanity of tooth blackening, others actually endorsed it as a form of voluntary suffering that brought the practitioner closer to God. The mystic Julian of Norwich wrote in her Revelations of Divine Love about how the pain of deliberately damaged teeth could serve as a constant reminder of Christ's suffering. The medical consequences were predictably horrific. Medieval physicians like Guy de Chauliac documented in his Chirurgia Magna from 1363 the connection between fashionable tooth decay and what they called mouth death, severe infection that would spread from the rotted teeth to the jaw, throat, and eventually throughout the entire body. Yet women continued the practice even when it literally killed them. But here's what really gets me. The peer pressure was so intense that women who maintained naturally healthy teeth were often accused of being poor or common. The Burgundian chronicler Georges Chastelain wrote in 1470 about noble ladies who would hide their white teeth behind fans or veils, ashamed of their dental health because it suggested they couldn't afford proper decay. The daily maintenance of fashionably rotten teeth was a complex ritual. Women would rise early to apply fresh coats of tooth-blackening compounds, carefully tend to their artificial cavities, and use specialized picks to remove any new tooth growth that might threaten their carefully cultivated decay. The morning dental routine of a fashionable medieval lady took longer than most modern beauty regimens. What strikes me as particularly tragic is how this trend affected eating. Having genuinely rotten teeth made chewing incredibly painful, so many women subsisted on soft foods or liquids, further compromising their health. The personal correspondence of Margaret of Austria preserved in the Archives Générales du Royaume in Brussels, includes letters describing how her fashionable dental decay made eating solid food impossible, forcing her to survive on wine and broth. The tools for eating with rotten teeth became their own luxury industry. Silver straws for drinking, specialized spoons designed to avoid contact with sensitive teeth, and even pre-chewed food preparation services for nobles whose dental decay made normal eating impossible. The wealthy were literally paying people to chew their food for them so they could maintain their fashionable tooth rot. And here's perhaps the most ironic detail. Many women who achieved the perfect rotten smile found that the pain and infection made speaking difficult. Court records show that some nobles communicated primarily through written notes because opening their mouths to speak caused too much agony. They had achieved the ultimate status symbol, but lost the ability to show it off. The end of the black teeth trend came gradually, often driven by the very real threat of death from dental infection. But even as the deliberately rotten look faded, it was replaced by equally extreme practices. The human obsession with transforming the natural mouth into something artificial was far from over. In fact, what came next in the world of medieval lip beauty makes blackened teeth seem almost reasonable by comparison. While medieval ladies were busy destroying their teeth for fashion, they were simultaneously obsessing over their lips in ways that would make modern beauty enthusiasts seem positively conservative. But here's the twist that will absolutely shock you. The medieval pursuit of the perfect red pout involved ingredients so toxic that women were literally kissing death every time they applied their lipstick. We're talking about cosmetics that contained enough mercury and lead to kill a horse, applied daily to one of the most sensitive parts of the human body. Let me paint you a picture that would make any toxicologist faint. It's 1456, and you're watching Lucrezia Borgia prepare for a papal banquet. Her servant carefully applies what looks like blood-red paint to her lips, but as you lean closer you notice something terrifying. The mixture is actually steaming slightly, and where it touches her skin, there's a faint sizzling sound. This isn't makeup, it's a chemical weapon disguised as beauty enhancement. The obsession with blood-red lips in medieval Europe wasn't just about aesthetics, it was deeply rooted in religious and social symbolism. According to the treatise De Coloribus et Artibus Romanorum by Heraclius, written around 1200, red lips were believed to represent the blood of Christ, making them not just beautiful but spiritually significant. Can you imagine justifying poisoning yourself as a religious act? But here's where it gets absolutely insane. The ingredients used to create these deadly lip colours read like a medieval witch's shopping list. The most popular recipe, documented in the Liber de Coloribus Illuminatorum Sive Pictorum from the monastery of Saint Denis, called for cinnabar, mercury sulfide, red lead oxide, crushed beetles, and something called virgin's blood, which thankfully was actually just a plant extract, though no less toxic for the name. The application process was a daily dance with death. Women would use tiny silver brushes, often made from actual poison ivy stems for added enhancement, to carefully paint their lips with these toxic concoctions. The burning sensation was considered part of the beauty ritual. If your lips didn't sting and swell slightly, the cosmetic wasn't strong enough to achieve the desired intense red colour. Court records from the Palace of the Pope in Avignon describe how Cardinal Pierre-Roger de Beaufort's niece, Marie de Beaufort, would spend 2 hours each morning applying and reapplying her lip rouge, often until her lips bled from the chemical burns. The blood mixing with the cosmetic created what she called the perfect Christ red, a shade so intense it was visible from across a cathedral. Here's a detail that always makes my skin crawl. Women would often lick their lips throughout the day to maintain the colour's intensity, unknowingly ingesting massive amounts of heavy metals. The personal physician to Catherine de' Medici, Jean Fernel, documented in his medical journals from 1554 a condition he called rouge madness, mercury poisoning specifically caused by lip cosmetic ingestion, which led to hallucinations, tremors, and eventually death. The social pressure to maintain these deadly red lips was absolutely crushing. The Venetian beauty manual Degli Ornamenti delle Donne by Giovanni Marinello, published in 1562, explicitly stated that a woman who appeared in public without properly reddened lips was demonstrating either poverty or moral failing. The implication was clear. If you couldn't afford to slowly poison yourself with expensive lip cosmetics, you weren't worth socializing with. But the toxic ingredients weren't the only dangerous aspect of medieval lip beauty. The application tools themselves were often lethal. Archaeological excavations at Chateau Gaillard have uncovered lip brushes made from materials like lead wire, mercury-soaked animal hair, and even tiny needles used to create deliberate cuts in the lips, so the red cosmetic would sink deeper into the tissue. The regional variations in deadly lip cosmetics were fascinatingly diverse. While French nobles preferred their mercury-based reds, Italian aristocrats favoured what they called Roman blood, a mixture of red lead and crushed coral that was supposedly less toxic but actually caused faster kidney failure. Spanish court ladies developed their own signature shade using a combination of cinnabar and powdered ruby that cost more than most people's annual income. Here's something that might surprise you about the medieval mindset. Many women were fully aware that their lip cosmetics were poisonous. The personal correspondence of Bonchet of Lancaster, preserved in the British National Archives, includes a letter to her daughter warning about the dangers of the Red Death, while simultaneously providing detailed instructions for achieving the perfect shade. The attitude seemed to be, "This will kill you, but you'll look absolutely stunning while dying." The Church's relationship with lip cosmetics was fascinatingly hypocritical. While official doctrine condemned vanity and artificial enhancement, many religious texts actually encouraged red lips as a way to honour the blood of Christ. The mystic Hildegard of Bingen wrote in her Physica about how red lips could serve as a form of prayer, bringing the wearer closer to divine understanding through beautiful suffering. The daily maintenance routine for these toxic lips was exhaustingly complex. Women would wake before dawn to begin the lengthy process of lip preparation, which involved first scrubbing their lips raw with abrasive compounds, then applying base layers of lead-based foundation, followed by the coloured mercury compounds, and finally a setting powder made from crushed pearls and more lead. The entire process took up to 3 hours and had to be repeated multiple times throughout the day. But here's the most shocking part. The medical community of the time actually endorsed these practices. The renowned physician Arnaldus de Villanova wrote in his 1285 treatise, Regimen Sanitatis, that regular application of mercury-based lip cosmetics could cure everything from melancholy to infertility. Medieval doctors were literally prescribing poison as medicine and beauty treatment simultaneously. The economic impact of this deadly beauty trend was staggering. Account books from the household of Joan of Navarre show that her annual expenditure on lip cosmetics exceeded the cost of feeding her entire retinue for 6 months. The ingredients alone, mercury, lead, crushed precious stones, exotic pigments, represented some of the most expensive substances available in medieval Europe. What strikes me as particularly tragic is how this practice affected intimate relationships. Husbands were often warned not to kiss their wives for several hours after lip application, not out of respect for the makeup, but because the toxicity could cause immediate chemical burns to the man's mouth and tongue. Imagine being so beautiful that you're literally too dangerous to kiss. The tools for maintaining poison lips became their own specialized industry. silver scrapers for removing the previous day's toxic buildup, ivory containers lined with gold to prevent the cosmetics from corroding through regular materials, and even specialized spittoons for the bloody saliva that resulted from daily mercury ingestion. These women needed an entire arsenal of equipment just to maintain their deadly beauty routine. And here's perhaps the most heartbreaking detail. Many women developed what medieval physicians called lip addiction, a compulsive need to constantly reapply their toxic cosmetics, not for beauty, but because the mercury withdrawal symptoms were so severe that they felt they couldn't function without their daily dose of poison. The irony is absolutely staggering when you consider that these women had access to perfectly safe alternatives. Natural red pigments from berries, flowers, and clay were readily available and could create beautiful lip colours without any toxic effects. But the safe options weren't expensive enough, dangerous enough, or prestigious enough to satisfy the medieval hunger for conspicuous suffering. As this deadly lip trend reached its peak, it began to intersect with equally extreme practices affecting other parts of the body. Because while medieval women were poisoning their mouths in the name of beauty, they were simultaneously engaging in hair practices that would make everything we've discussed seem almost reasonable by comparison. The poisonous lip obsession was just the beginning of medieval beauty madness. When it came to hair, medieval women took the concept of suffering for beauty to heights that would literally break your neck, sometimes quite literally. Imagine walking into a 15th century banquet and seeing women whose elaborate hairstyles are so tall and heavy that they need servants to help them sit down, special doorways to walk through, and sometimes even wheelchairs to move around. We're talking about hair sculptures that were more architecture than hairstyle, often weighing more than a small child and requiring teams of people to maintain. Transport yourself to the court of Burgundy in 1467, where you witness something that defies all logic. The Duchess Isabella of Portugal enters the Great Hall, but she can't actually walk through the main entrance because her hair tower, yes, that's what they called it, is over 4 feet tall. She has to use a specially constructed side entrance designed specifically for these architectural hair creations. Her hairstyle is so elaborate, it includes working miniature windmills, tiny gardens with live flowers, and even small cages containing live birds. This isn't hairstyling, it's engineering. The trend of impossibly elaborate hairstyles wasn't just about vanity, it was a complex system of social communication. According to the detailed court records preserved in the Archives départementales de la Côte d'Or, the height and complexity of a woman's hairstyle directly corresponded to her social rank and political influence. The higher your hair, the higher your status. It was literally a walking hierarchy displayed on top of your head. But here's where it gets absolutely insane. These hair towers weren't made entirely of the woman's own hair. They were complex constructions using wire frames, padding made from everything including horse hair and sheep's wool, and often incorporated entirely artificial elements. The inventory records from the Palace of Margaret of York, preserved in the British Library, list hair accessories including silver wire scaffolding, brass support beams, and wooden foundation blocks, essentially the components for building a small house on someone's head. The daily maintenance of these hair sculptures was a full-time job, literally. Wealthy women employed teams of hair architects who would arrive before dawn to begin the complex process of constructing the day's hairstyle. The process, as documented in the household accounts of Anne of Brittany, typically took between 4 to 8 hours and required at least 3 specialized servants working simultaneously. Here's a detail that always makes me pause. Many of these elaborate hairstyles were never taken down. Court physicians like Jean de Tourne wrote in his 1485 medical treatise about treating noble ladies for scalp rot infections caused by leaving the same elaborate hairstyle in place for weeks or even months at a time. The smell, according to contemporary accounts, was often masked by expensive perfumes, but the health consequences were devastating. The construction techniques were surprisingly sophisticated. The Secret des Secrets, a beauty manual from the Abbey of Fontevraud dating to 1398, contains detailed architectural drawings showing how to build proper foundation structures for hair towers. These weren't casual instructions, they were technical blueprints requiring knowledge of weight distribution, structural engineering, and even basic physics to prevent the entire construction from toppling over and potentially killing the wearer. But the most shocking aspect was the competitive nature of this hair architecture. Noble families would literally try to outbuild each other with increasingly elaborate and dangerous hairstyles. The chronicler Olivier de la Marche documented in his memoirs how the court ladies of Burgundy engaged in what he called the Great Hair Wars, with each woman trying to create a more impressive tower than her rivals, regardless of the physical cost. The economic impact was staggering. Account books from the court of Charles the Bold show that maintaining a single elaborate hairstyle could cost more than a year's wages for a skilled craftsman. The materials are lone silk padding, precious metal wire, exotic feathers, jewels, and specialized tools represented investments that rivaled the cost of castles. Here's something that might surprise you. These hair constructions often served multiple purposes beyond just beauty. Court records from the Palace of the Dukes of Burgundy describe hair towers that included hidden compartments for storing love letters, poison, small weapons, and even religious relics. Some women essentially wore elaborate storage systems disguised as hairstyles. The tools required for building these hair monuments were equally impressive. Archaeological excavations at medieval castle sites have uncovered specialized combs that were over 2 feet long, heating irons that weighed several pounds, and elaborate pulley systems designed to help lift and position the heaviest hairpieces. The personal hair toolkit of a noble lady was essentially a construction crew's worth of equipment. But here's where it gets truly tragic. The physical toll was enormous. Medieval medical texts describe a condition they called tower neck, chronic pain, and sometimes permanent damage to the cervical spine caused by supporting these massive hair constructions. The physician Guy de Chauliac wrote in his Grande Chirurgie about performing surgery on noble ladies whose neck vertebrae had been crushed by the weight of their fashionable hairstyles. The sleeping arrangements alone were logistically nightmarish. Women with tower hairstyles often slept sitting upright in specially constructed chairs or in beds with raised headboards that could accommodate their hair architecture. The personal diary of Marie de Clèves, preserved in the Archives Nationales, describes months of sleepless nights due to the impossibility of finding a comfortable sleeping position with her elaborate hair construction. And then there were the weather challenges. Rain could destroy weeks of work in minutes, wind could literally knock a woman over, and extreme heat could cause the various adhesives and waxes holding the structure together to melt, creating what contemporary accounts describe as hair avalanches that buried the wearer in their own artificial locks. The regional competitions were fierce and often politically motivated. French court ladies developed what they called the cathedral stiercing, hairstyles that literally incorporated miniature Gothic architecture, complete with flying buttresses and rose windows. Italian nobles responded with the fortress-look hair towers designed to resemble medieval castles, sometimes including tiny cannons that could actually fire small projectiles during court entertainments. Perhaps the most heartbreaking aspect was how this trend affected young girls. Court records show that girls as young as 10 were having their necks strengthened through special exercises to prepare them for carrying adult-sized hair towers. The Venetian ambassador Andrea Gritti wrote in 1503 about witnessing child hair slaves whose entire childhood was spent in preparation for eventually supporting these architectural monstrosities. The psychological impact was severe. Many women developed what medieval physicians called tower madness, an obsessive need to constantly increase the height and complexity of their hairstyles, often to the point where they could no longer function in daily life. The personal correspondence of Isabella d'Este includes letters describing her complete inability to participate in normal activities due to the size and fragility of her hair construction. Here's an ironic detail. Many of these elaborate hairstyles were so complex that the women wearing them couldn't actually see or touch their own hair. They were walking around with massive structures on their heads that they had no direct control over, completely dependent on their servants for any adjustments or maintenance. The fire hazard was constant and terrifying. These hair towers, filled with wax, oils, and various flammable materials, were essentially torches waiting to ignite. Court records document multiple instances of noble ladies literally going up in flames during torchlit evening events. The term hair fire appears repeatedly in medieval accident reports, often with fatal outcomes. The end of the hair tower era came gradually, often forced by practical concerns rather than fashion changes, as doorways had to be constantly enlarged, furniture redesigned, and entire architectural modifications made to accommodate these hairstyles. The economic and logistical burden became unsustainable even for the wealthiest families. But even as the hair towers fell out of fashion, they were replaced by equally extreme practices that affected other parts of the medieval body. Because while some women were building architectural monuments on their heads, others were engaging in body modification practices that would make everything we've discussed seem almost reasonable by comparison. As extreme as those towering hairstyles were, they pale in comparison to what medieval women were willing to do to their entire body silhouette. Here's something that will completely rewrite your understanding of medieval fashion. Imagine a world where every single woman, from peasant to princess, deliberately shaped their body to look exactly like they were 6 months pregnant. Not just full-figured or curvy, but specifically sporting that distinctive rounded belly that screams baby on board. This wasn't an accident of fashion, it was the most intentional and widespread body modification trend in human history. Step into any medieval painting from 1350 to 1500, and you'll notice something unmistakable. Every woman looks pregnant. The Virgin Mary, noble ladies, merchant wives, even mythological figures, they all share that same distinctive forward protruding belly that would make modern maternity wear designers weep with joy. But here's the shocking truth. Most of these women weren't actually pregnant. They were wearing elaborate padding systems designed to create what medieval fashion called the blessed silhouette. According to the detailed wardrobe inventories preserved in the Archives Nationales de France, the artificial pregnancy look required an entire infrastructure of undergarments and padding. The court records of Isabella of Valois from 1389 list no fewer than 15 different types of belly padding, ranging from light morning pregnancy for casual wear to full-term ceremonial for important court functions. Can you imagine having a wardrobe specifically organised by trimester of fake pregnancy? The construction of these artificial baby bumps was surprisingly sophisticated. The fashion manual Le Livre des Trois Vertus by Christine de Pizan, written in 1405, contains detailed instructions for creating the perfect pregnant silhouette using layers of wool padding, specially shaped wooden frameworks, and even inflatable bladders made from pig intestines. These weren't simple pillow stuffings. They were engineered body modifications requiring actual carpentry skills. But here's what makes this trend absolutely mind-boggling. It wasn't just about looking pregnant, it was about looking permanently, perpetually, optimally pregnant. The ideal medieval silhouette suggested not just fertility, but constant ongoing fertility. Women were essentially advertising their reproductive capabilities 24 hours a day, 365 days a year, whether they were actually pregnant or not. The symbolism was complex and deeply rooted in medieval theology. According to the writings of the mystic Marguerite Porete in her Mirror of Simple Souls, the pregnant belly represented not just physical fertility but spiritual abundance, a woman's capacity to nurture both earthly and divine life. The artificial pregnancy wasn't vanity, it was a religious statement about a woman's role in God's creation. The regional variations were fascinating and often competitive. French court ladies preferred what they called the Madonna belly, a perfectly round, high-positioned bump that suggested early to mid-pregnancy. Italian nobles developed the abundance style, a lower, more dramatically protruding silhouette that implied twins or even triplets. Flemish women created their own signature look with what contemporary accounts describe as the harvest belly, wider and more sprawling, suggesting not just pregnancy but abundant prosperity. Here's where it gets truly bizarre. The padding systems were often permanent installations. Court records from the household of Margaret of Anjou describe seamstresses who specialised in sewing padding directly into women's clothing, creating what were essentially built-in pregnancy suits that couldn't be removed without cutting the entire garment apart. Some women literally couldn't take off their fake pregnancy. The daily logistics were enormously complex. These artificial bellies required constant maintenance and adjustment. The personal diary of Marie de Berry, preserved in the Bibliothèque de l'Arsenal, describes a morning routine that included belly inspection, padding redistribution, and silhouette verification, essentially quality control for fake pregnancy. Imagine having to check your artificial baby bump every morning like adjusting a corset. But perhaps the most shocking aspect was how this trend affected actual pregnancy. When women were genuinely pregnant, they often had to add extra padding to achieve the fashionably exaggerated pregnancy silhouette. Real pregnancy wasn't pregnant enough for medieval fashion standards. Court physicians like Henri de Mondeville wrote in his surgical treatises about treating pregnant women who had injured themselves by wearing excessive belly padding on top of their natural pregnancy. The economic impact was staggering. Account books from the court of Charles VI show that maintaining a fashionable artificial pregnancy cost approximately the same as feeding a noble household for 3 months. The specialised padding materials, fine wool, silk stuffing, wooden frameworks, metal support structures represented a significant luxury industry built entirely around fake reproduction. Here's a detail that always makes me pause. The Church's response was fascinatingly contradictory. While official doctrine emphasized modesty and natural appearance, many religious texts actually praised the artificial pregnancy look as honoring the Virgin Mary's blessed condition. The theologian Jean Gerson wrote in his 1395 treatise, On the Magnificat, that women who maintained the pregnant silhouette were engaging in a form of continuous prayer honoring divine motherhood. The social pressure was intense and unforgiving. Women who appeared without proper belly padding were often accused of either vanity, suggesting they thought their natural figure was superior to the blessed pregnant form, or worse, of practicing birth control or being barren. The artificial pregnancy became a requirement for social acceptability, regardless of a woman's actual reproductive status or desires. But the physical consequences were severe. Medieval medical texts describe a condition called false womb sickness, chronic back pain, digestive problems, and respiratory issues caused by wearing heavy artificial belly padding for extended periods. The physician Tadeu Alderotti wrote extensively about treating noble ladies whose artificial pregnancies had caused more health problems than actual childbirth. The tools and techniques for maintaining these fake pregnancies were surprisingly advanced. Archaeological excavations have uncovered specialized corsetry designed to support artificial bellies, adjustable padding systems that could simulate the progression of pregnancy, and even mechanical devices that could create the appearance of fetal movement. Some women were essentially wearing pregnancy simulators. Here's something that might surprise you. The trend extended beyond just visual appearance. Some women would actually practice pregnancy behaviors, special walking gaits, hand positions on their artificial bellies, even dietary restrictions to complete the illusion. Court etiquette manuals from the period contain detailed instructions on how to carry your artificial pregnancy convincingly. The psychological impact was profound and often troubling. Many women developed what medieval physicians called phantom pregnancy of the soul, a condition where women wearing artificial bellies began to experience actual pregnancy symptoms, including nausea, food cravings, and emotional changes. The line between performance and reality became dangerously blurred, and here's perhaps the most ironic aspect. This obsession with looking pregnant often interfered with actual reproduction. The heavy padding and tight bindings required to maintain the artificial pregnancy silhouette could actually reduce fertility and complicate real pregnancies. Women were literally making themselves less capable of achieving the condition they were pretending to have. The end of the artificial pregnancy trend came gradually, often replaced by equally extreme body modification practices. As we'll discover next, while some medieval women were padding their bellies to look constantly pregnant, others were engaging in foot modification practices that would make the fake pregnancy padding seem almost reasonable by comparison. From artificial pregnancies, we now venture into what might be the most physically destructive beauty trend in medieval European history. You've heard of foot binding in ancient China, but did you know that medieval Europe had its own equally devastating foot modification practices? Picture this. Noble women wearing shoes so impossibly long and pointed that they had to be physically chained to their legs to prevent tripping. Shoes so extreme that walking became nearly impossible, and permanent foot deformity was guaranteed. Welcome to the world of poulaines, the medieval foot torture disguised as high fashion. Envision yourself at a royal feast in 1382 at the court of Richard II of England. As you observe the assembled nobility, something strikes you as absurdly surreal. Every fashionable person in the room appears to be wearing what can only be described as medieval elf shoes, but taken to such extremes that they look more like weapons than footwear. The points of these shoes extend so far beyond the actual foot that many guests are literally chained at the ankle, not as punishment, but as the only way to walk without constantly tripping over their own feet. These weren't just slightly pointed shoes we're talking about. According to the detailed sumptuary laws recorded in the Rolls of Parliament from 1363, the length of a person's shoe points was strictly regulated by social class. Commoners were limited to points no longer than 6 inches beyond their toes. Knights and lower nobility could extend to 12 inches. But members of the highest nobility, their shoe points could legally extend up to 24 inches. That's 2 full feet of additional length beyond their actual feet. The construction of these extreme poulaines required genuine engineering expertise. The Shoemaking Guild records preserved in the archives of the City of London describe specialised craftsmen called point masters, whose entire profession was dedicated to creating the internal support structures that prevented these absurdly long shoes from simply collapsing under their own weight. These weren't shoes, they were architectural projects for your feet. But here's where the story takes a truly dark turn. Achieving the perfect poulaine fit required permanently altering the shape of human feet. The guild records of the Cordwainers Company from 1389 contain detailed instructions for foot preparation. a process that involved systematically breaking and reshaping toe bones to create feet that could properly fill these extreme shoes. Medieval shoemakers were essentially performing surgery without anesthesia. The daily experience of wearing poulaines was a constant battle against physics and human anatomy. Court records from the Palace of Westminster describe elaborate protocols for helping nobles navigate stairs, doorways, and even chairs while wearing their extreme footwear. Special servants called point-bearers were employed whose sole job was to lift and guide the extended tips of their master's shoes during movement. According to the chronicles of Jean Froissart, completed around 1400, the fashion had become so extreme that many nobles could no longer walk normally. He describes witnessing courtiers who had to develop entirely new gaits walking almost on tiptoe, with a peculiar shuffling motion to avoid catching their shoe points on irregularities in the floor. Some wealthy individuals hired servants to walk in front of them, clearing the path of any obstacles that might snag their foot extensions. The medical consequences were predictably horrific. The physician John of Ardern wrote in his surgical manual Practica Chirurgiae from 1306 about treating nobles for what he called point foot, a condition involving hammer toes, bunions, and eventually complete inability to walk without the specialized shoes. The irony was cruel. People became so dependent on their deformed footwear that removing the shoes was more painful than wearing them. But perhaps the most shocking aspect was the competitive escalation. Noble families would engage in what contemporary accounts describe as point wars, trying to outdo each other with increasingly extreme shoe lengths. The court records of John of Gaunt show payments to shoemakers for creating shoes with points so long they required small wheels attached to the tips to prevent them from dragging on the ground. The Church's response was swift and unequivocal. Pope Urban V issued a papal bull in 1365 specifically condemning poulaines as tools of the devil that prevented proper kneeling during prayer. The Archbishop of Canterbury, Simon Sudbury, wrote extensively about how the extreme shoes made it impossible for the faithful to assume proper devotional positions, calling them Satan's hooves in his 1378 pastoral letter. Here's a detail that always makes me wince. The social shame associated with naturally shaped feet became so intense that many people chose permanent foot deformity over social exclusion. The personal diary of Margaret Kemp, preserved in the British Library, describes her decision to have her feet properly pointed through deliberate bone breaking, despite knowing it would leave her permanently disabled because she couldn't bear the shame of appearing in public with normal foot proportions. The economic impact was staggering and often bankrupting. Account books from noble households show that maintaining fashionable poulaines, including the specialized shoes, the chains and support structures, the servants required to help with mobility, and the constant repairs could cost more than maintaining a warhorse. Families went into debt to keep up with foot fashion. The practical challenges were almost comically absurd. Castle architecture had to be modified to accommodate extreme poulaines. Doorways were widened, stairs were redesigned with lower risers, and even furniture had to be adjusted. The renovation records from Warwick Castle show extensive modifications made in 1385, specifically to make the building poulaine-friendly. But the most tragic aspect was how the trend affected children. Court records show that children as young as 7 were having their feet bound and shaped to prepare them for adult poulaines. The process, described in medieval medical texts, involved wrapping children's feet in progressively tighter bindings, often for years, to create the elongated, narrow foot shape that could properly wear the extreme shoes. The military implications were significant and often deadly. Chronicle accounts from the Battle of Nicopolis in 1396 describe French knights who couldn't flee effectively because their poulaines made running impossible. Some warriors actually died in battle not from enemy weapons, but from tripping over their own ridiculous footwear. The fashion literally killed people. Here's something that might surprise you. The extreme poulains often served as weapons themselves. Court records from various assault cases describe nobles using their pointed shoes to kick opponents, sometimes causing serious injuries. The sheriff's rolls from London contain multiple entries about point assault attacks carried out using weaponized footwear. The regional variations were striking. While English nobles preferred the classic single-point design, French courtiers developed devil's claw poulains with multiple curved points resembling talons. Italian nobles created their own signature style with upward curving points that could extend above the knee when sitting. Each region seemed determined to find new ways to make walking impossible. The psychological impact was profound and often permanent. Many individuals who wore extreme poulains for years developed what medieval physicians called point dependency, a condition where people felt they couldn't appear in public without their deformed shoes, even after the fashion had passed. The artificial foot shape became part of their identity. The end of the poulain era came gradually, often forced by practical considerations rather than fashion changes. As warfare became more mobile and urban life more complex, the simple inability to move effectively in extreme footwear made the trend unsustainable. But the human cost had already been paid in thousands of permanently deformed feet. Yet even as the pointed shoe craze finally ended, medieval beauty culture was far from finished with self-destructive practices. While nobles were recovering from their foot deformities, another equally dangerous trend was emerging that focused on an entirely different aspect of personal grooming. After centuries of deforming their feet for fashion, medieval Europeans turned their attention to a completely different kind of sensory experience, one that would literally assault your nostrils while supposedly enhancing your attractiveness. What I'm about to tell you will fundamentally change how you think about medieval romance. The most seductive people of the era wore fragrances so potent and toxic that they could cause unconsciousness, organ failure, and sometimes death. We're not talking about a little too much cologne here. We're talking about walking chemical warfare disguised as perfume. Imagine entering a medieval banquet hall in 1475 and being hit by a wall of scent so overwhelming that your eyes immediately begin watering. The air is thick with what can only be described as a toxic cloud of competing fragrances, each more overpowering than the last. Some guests are literally wearing masks, not for mysterious allure, but because breathing the perfumed air without protection could cause fainting spells. This isn't a gathering of people, it's a chemical experiment in human endurance. The medieval obsession with extreme scents wasn't just about covering up poor hygiene, though that was certainly part of it. According to the detailed perfume recipes preserved in the Secreti Universali by Alessio Piemontese from 1555, medieval perfumes served multiple purposes: attraction, protection against disease, spiritual purification, and most importantly, demonstration of wealth through olfactory excess. The stronger and more exotic your scent, the more obvious your access to rare and expensive ingredients. But here's where it gets absolutely terrifying. The ingredients used in medieval perfumes read like a poison manual. The most popular recipe documented in the beauty treatise Ornatus Mulierum by Trotula of Salerno called for a base mixture of mercury, lead acetate, arsenic compounds, and something called aqua vitae, essentially pure alcohol mixed with toxic plant extracts. People were literally dousing themselves in heavy metal solutions and wondering why they felt dizzy afterward. The application methods were as extreme as the ingredients. Court records from the palace of the Dukes of Burgundy describe a morning perfume ritual that took over 2 hours and required protective clothing for the servants applying it. The process involved saturating every piece of clothing, all jewellery, hair, and even the interior of shoes with these toxic fragrances. By the time a fashionable noble was fully dressed, they were essentially a walking toxic waste site. Here's a detail that always makes my skin crawl. Medieval perfume wasn't just applied to the body, it was often consumed internally. The physician Arnaldus de Villanova wrote in his 1285 medical treatise about nobles who would drink small amounts of their perfume mixtures, believing it would make their breath and even their sweat smell appealing. They were literally poisoning themselves from the inside out for the sake of total body fragrance. The competitive aspect of medieval perfuming reached truly dangerous levels. The chronicler Philip de Comines wrote in his memoirs about court ladies engaging in what he called scent wars, where each woman tried to wear a more overpowering fragrance than her rivals. The goal wasn't subtlety, it was complete olfactory domination of any space you entered. According to the detailed account books of Isabella d'Este, preserved in the State Archives of Mantua, maintaining a fashionable scent wardrobe could cost more than feeding a noble household for 6 months. The exotic ingredients ambergris from whale intestines, civet glands from African cats, musk from Tibetan deer, precious oils from distant lands represented some of the most expensive substances in medieval trade. But the most shocking aspect was the medical consequences. Medieval physicians like Pietro d'Abano documented in his Conciliator from 1310 a condition they called perfume madness, neurological damage caused by prolonged exposure to toxic fragrance ingredients. Symptoms included hallucinations, memory loss, violent mood swings, and eventually complete mental breakdown. The pursuit of attractive scent was literally driving people insane. The social pressure was intense and often deadly. Court records from various European palaces describe incidents where individuals who appeared without sufficient perfuming were accused of insulting the assembled company. Not wearing toxic fragrance wasn't just unfashionable, it was considered a form of social assault, suggesting you didn't care enough about others to make yourself pleasant to be around. Here's something that might surprise you. Many medieval perfumes were designed to mimic the scent of decay and death. The beauty manual Le Secret des Secrets, attributed to Albertus Magnus, contains recipes for fragrances meant to smell like sweet corruption or beautiful putrefaction. The idea was that the scent of controlled decay was more sophisticated and attractive than natural human odours. The regional variations were striking and often reflected local access to toxic materials. French nobles preferred what they called the Paris poison, a mixture heavy in mercury and lead that gave off a metallic sweetness. Italian aristocrats favoured Roman death, a combination of arsenic compounds and exotic oils that produced a cloying, almost suffocating aroma. English court ladies developed their own signature scent using local ingredients like nightshade and foxglove, literally perfuming themselves with some of the most poisonous plants in Europe. The storage and preparation of these toxic perfumes required specialized knowledge and equipment. Perfume laboratories, as described in the household inventories of Anne of Brittany, resembled alchemical workshops more than beauty rooms. They included distillation equipment, protective masks, ventilation systems, and even antidotes for accidental poisoning during the perfume-making process. But perhaps the most heartbreaking aspect was how this trend affected intimate relationships. Marriage contracts from the period often included clauses about perfume compatibility, essentially prenuptial agreements about whether spouses could tolerate each other's toxic fragrances. The personal correspondence of Margaret of Austria includes letters describing how her husband's perfume made her physically ill, creating genuine marital discord over scent choices. The daily experience of wearing these extreme perfumes was a constant battle against poisoning symptoms. The diary of Marie de Rohan, preserved in the Bibliothèque Nationale, contains detailed descriptions of the daily side effects: nausea, headaches, skin irritation, difficulty breathing, and what she called scent sickness, a general malaise caused by her own fragrance choices. Here's an ironic detail. Many people became so dependent on their toxic perfumes that they couldn't function without them. Not because they smelled bad naturally, but because the chemical dependency created by daily heavy metal exposure made them feel physically ill when they tried to go without their poisonous fragrances. They were literally addicted to their beauty products. The fire hazard was constant and terrifying. These alcohol-based toxic perfumes were essentially flammable chemical solutions, and torchlit medieval halls became incredibly dangerous spaces. Court records document multiple instances of nobles literally catching fire from their own perfume, sometimes with fatal results. The end of the toxic perfume era came gradually, often forced by the simple reality that too many people were dying from their fragrance choices. But even as these deadly scents fell out of fashion, they were replaced by other equally extreme beauty practices. The human obsession with altering natural appearance through dangerous means was far from over, and what medieval beauties did to their eyes makes everything we've discussed seem almost reasonable. The toxic perfume obsession was devastating enough, but what medieval women did to their eyes makes poisonous fragrance seem like child's play. If you think modern beauty standards are extreme, prepare to have your mind completely blown. Medieval women deliberately binded themselves for beauty, not metaphorically, literally. They would drop concentrated poison directly into their eyes to achieve what they considered the perfect seductive gaze, knowing full well that permanent vision loss was not just possible, but probable. Travel with me to a Venetian palazzo in 1498, where you witness something that defies all logic. The Duchess Lucrezia Borgia sits perfectly still as her servant carefully drops liquid nightshade yes, the deadly poison, directly onto her eyeballs. Her pupils dilate to an unnatural size, her eyes begin watering uncontrollably, and she blinks rapidly as the toxic substance burns her corneas. But she smiles through the agony because she knows that in an hour she'll have what medieval beauty standards demanded, eyes so dramatically dilated and glassy that men would find her utterly irresistible. This practice, known as belladonna enhancement after the Italian phrase meaning beautiful woman, was based on the medieval belief that dilated pupils indicated sexual arousal and availability. According to the detailed medical treatise Practica Oculorum by Benvenutus Grassus from 1200, enlarged pupils were considered the most attractive feature a woman could possess, more important than clear skin or perfect features. But the nightshade drops were just the beginning of medieval eye modification. The beauty manual Secreti Universali by Isabella Cortesi, published in 1561, contains over 30 different recipes for eye-altering substances, including mixtures containing antimony, lead compounds, mercury, and even ground glass. Women were literally sandblasting their eyeballs in the name of beauty. The application process was a carefully choreographed dance with blindness. Court records from the palace of the Doges describe professional eye enhancers, servants who specialized in applying these toxic substances without killing their employers outright. The process required precise timing. Too little poison and the effect wasn't dramatic enough. Too much and permanent blindness was immediate rather than gradual. Here's where it gets truly horrifying. Many women developed what medieval physicians called beauty blindness, progressive vision loss specifically caused by cosmetic eye treatments. The physician Pietro d'Abano wrote extensively in his 1310 medical compendium about treating noble ladies whose pursuit of attractive eyes had left them unable to see their own reflection in mirrors. According to the detailed account books of Catherine de' Medici, preserved in the Archives Nationales, maintaining fashionable eye enhancement cost more than most people's annual income. The nightshade alone, imported from specialized growers who cultivated extra potent strains, was literally worth more than gold by weight. Women were spending fortunes to poison their vision. The social pressure was intense and often irrational. Court chronicles from the time describe how women with naturally small pupils were considered fundamentally unattractive, regardless of their other features. The personal diary of Anne Boleyn, kept before her marriage to Henry VIII, contains agonized entries about her peasant eyes and her desperate attempts to achieve the fashionable dilated look through increasingly dangerous means. But perhaps the most shocking aspect was the competitive escalation. Noble ladies would try to outdilate each other, using stronger and stronger concentrations of poison to achieve increasingly dramatic effects. The Venetian ambassador to the French court, Lorenzo Priuli, wrote in 1547 about witnessing court ladies whose pupils were so enlarged they looked like beautiful demons rather than human beings. The regional variations were striking and often reflected local access to different toxins. French court ladies preferred what they called Paris black, a mixture of nightshade and antimony that created not just pupil dilation, but also artificial dark circles that were considered seductive. Italian nobles developed their own signature look using a combination of mercury compounds and crushed pearls that gave eyes an otherworldly, almost glowing appearance. Here's a detail that always makes me shudder. The effects weren't just cosmetic. Medieval medical texts describe how these eye poisons affect behavior and personality. Women using regular nightshade applications often develop what physicians called belladonna madness, hallucinations, paranoia, and violent mood swings caused by the toxic alkaloids being absorbed through their eyes. The daily experience of maintaining poisoned eyes was a constant battle against blindness and insanity. The personal correspondence of Lucrezia Borgia includes letters describing the daily side effects: blurred vision, sensitivity to light so severe she could only appear in public at night, constant headaches, and what she described as eye demons, visual hallucinations caused by her beauty routine. The tools used for eye poisoning were surprisingly sophisticated. Archaeological excavations at Renaissance palace sites have uncovered tiny silver droppers designed specifically for applying liquid toxins to eyeballs, specialized mirrors with darkened glass to help women see their dilated pupils, and even small vials with measuring marks to ensure precise dosing of poison. But the most tragic aspect was how this trend affected daily life. Women with severely dilated pupils couldn't see clearly in bright light, making daytime activities nearly impossible. Many nobles became essentially nocturnal, appearing only at candlelit evenings events because daylight was too painful for their poisoned eyes. The Church's response was fascinatingly complex. While official doctrine condemned vanity, some religious texts actually praised the belladonna look, comparing dilated pupils to the eyes of divine ecstasy described in mystical visions. The poisoned gaze became associated not just with seduction, but with spiritual rapture. Here's an ironic detail that always strikes me. Many women became so dependent on their eye poisons that they couldn't appear in public without them. Not because they looked bad with normal pupils, but because the withdrawal symptoms from regular nightshade use included such severe depression and anxiety that they felt unable to socialize without their toxic enhancement. The medical consequences were predictably devastating. Court physicians like Girolamo Mercuriale documented in his 1584 treatise De Oculorum et Mentis Morbis the connection between fashionable eye enhancement and what they called noble blindness, vision loss, that affected primarily wealthy women who could afford the most potent eye poisons. The end of the belladonna era came gradually, often forced by the simple reality that too many influential women were going blind. But even as this particular practice faded, it was replaced by other equally extreme forms of body modification. Medieval beauty culture seemed incapable of finding a balance between enhancement and self-destruction, and what came next in the realm of physical alteration would make poisoned eyes seem almost reasonable by comparison. Beyond the deliberate eye poisoning, medieval beauty culture developed an even more extreme practice that would make everything we've discussed seem almost gentle by comparison. Brace yourself for the most shocking revelation yet. Medieval nobles didn't just alter their appearance. They systematically tortured their bodies into entirely new shapes through a practice that makes modern shapewear look like a gentle hug. We're talking about body modification so extreme that it required mechanical devices, daily agony, and often permanent internal organ damage, all in pursuit of what they called the divine silhouette. Transport yourself to a Flemish castle in 1456, where you witness something that defies human anatomy. The Countess Marie de Clèves is being dressed by 6 servants, but what they're putting on her isn't clothing, it's essentially a medieval torture device, disguised as undergarments. The contraption involves metal stays, whalebone reinforcements, leather bindings, and a complex pulley system that can literally reshape her ribcage, compress her organs, and create an hourglass figure so extreme that she can barely breathe, let alone move naturally. This wasn't just tight lacing as we might imagine it. According to the detailed tailoring records preserved in the Guild archives of Bruges, medieval body shaping involved what they called bone restructuring, a process where young women's ribs would be systematically compressed and reshaped over years to achieve the fashionable silhouette. We're talking about deliberate skeletal modification that makes Victorian corsets seem positively loose by comparison. The construction of these body-shaping devices required genuine engineering expertise. The tailoring manual Libro de Geometria y Traza by Juan de Alcaga, published in 1589, contains detailed technical drawings showing the internal structure of what they called body engines, corset-like devices with mechanical components that could be tightened using cranks and screws rather than simple lacing. But here's where it gets truly horrifying. Achieving the perfect medieval silhouette often began in childhood. Guild records from the Worshipful Company of Cordwainers show that girls as young as 8 would be fitted with shaping stays, miniature versions of adult body modification devices designed to gradually alter bone growth during development. Parents were literally having their children's skeletons reshaped for future beauty. The ideal silhouette, as described in the fashion treatise Trattato dell'arte del vestire by Cesare Vecellio from 1590, required what they called the wasp transformation, a waist so impossibly tiny that it looked inhuman, combined with an artificially enhanced bust and hips created through strategic padding. The goal wasn't to look like an attractive human being, it was to look like a beautiful insect. According to the detailed medical records of court physicians documented in manuscripts preserved at the Biblioteca Martiana in Venice, the health consequences were predictably devastating. Physicians described treating noble ladies for what they called crushing sickness, a condition involving displaced organs, damaged ribs, and chronic internal bleeding caused by extreme body compression. The daily experience of wearing these body-shaping devices was a constant battle against unconsciousness. The personal diary of Isabella of Aragon, preserved in the Archivo General de Simancas, contains daily entries documenting fainting spells, difficulty eating, and what she called the crushing pain that accompanied her pursuit of the perfect silhouette. Here's a detail that always makes me wince. Many women became so dependent on their body-shaping devices that removing them was physically dangerous. Their organs had been so displaced and their muscles so weakened that taking off the mechanical support could cause internal collapse. Court physicians like Fabricius Hildanus wrote in his 1646 surgical treatise about women who literally couldn't survive without their artificial body architecture. The competitive aspect reached truly dangerous levels. Noble families would engage in what contemporary accounts describe as waste wars, trying to achieve increasingly impossible body proportion. The court records of Philip II of Spain document payments to specialized craftsmen for creating corsets that could compress waists to measurements that seem physically impossible for human survival. But perhaps the most shocking aspect was the mechanical sophistication of these devices. Archaeological excavations at the Château de Fontainebleau have uncovered body-shaping devices with gear systems, adjustable compression chambers, and even primitive hydraulic mechanisms. These weren't simple undergarments, they were mechanical body modification machines. The regional variations were striking and often reflected local metalworking expertise. Spanish court ladies preferred what they called the Iron Maiden, body shapers with rigid metal frameworks that created an absolutely inflexible silhouette. French nobles developed their own signature style using complex wire and whalebone combinations that allowed for minimal movement while maintaining extreme compression. Italian aristocrats created body shapers with artistic metalwork that were essentially wearable sculptures. The Church's response was complex and often hypocritical. While official doctrine condemned vanity and bodily mortification for worldly purposes, many religious texts actually praised the suffering involved in extreme body shaping as a form of penance. The mystic Catherine of Genoa wrote about how the pain of body compression could bring the wearer closer to understanding Christ's suffering. Here's something that might surprise you. The economic impact extended far beyond the cost of the devices themselves. Maintaining the extreme medieval silhouette required specialized furniture, modified doorways, custom carriages, and even architectural changes to living spaces. The household accounts of Anne of Brittany show that accommodating her body-shaping devices cost more than maintaining a small army. The social pressure was intense and often deadly. Women who couldn't achieve or maintain the fashionable silhouette were often excluded from court functions and marriage prospects. The personal correspondence of Margaret of Austria includes desperate letters describing her attempts to achieve an even more extreme waist measurement, despite her physician's warnings that further compression could kill her. The daily routine of extreme body shaping was exhaustingly complex. Women would rise hours before dawn to begin the lengthy process of mechanical compression, often requiring teams of servants operating pulley systems and cranking devices. The morning dressing ritual could take up to 4 hours and had to be repeated any time adjustments were needed throughout the day. But the most tragic aspect was how this practice affected basic human functions. Eating became nearly impossible with severely compressed organs, breathing required conscious effort, and sitting or lying down required careful positioning to avoid internal injury. These women had essentially traded their humanity for an artificially perfect silhouette. The medical tools required to treat body-shaping injuries became their own specialized industry. Court physicians carried portable surgery kits specifically designed for treating crushed ribs, displaced organs, and internal bleeding caused by mechanical body modification. The line between fashion and medical emergency became dangerously blurred. As this extreme body modification reached its peak of sophistication and danger, it began to intersect with other equally extreme practices that affected different parts of the medieval body. While some women were mechanically reshaping their torsos, others were engaging in skin modification practices that would make everything we've discussed seem almost civilized. While some medieval women were mechanically crushing their rib cages for the perfect silhouette, others pursued an even more permanent form of body modification that would leave them marked for life. What I'm about to reveal will challenge everything you thought you knew about medieval beauty. Noble ladies didn't just paint themselves or reshape their bones, they deliberately scarred their own skin in intricate patterns, believing that controlled mutilation was the highest form of artistic beauty. We're talking about scarification so elaborate and painful that it makes modern tattoos seem like gentle tickles. Picture yourself in a German castle in 1482, witnessing something that belongs more in a torture chamber than a beauty salon. The Baroness Margaret von Habsburg lies perfectly still as a specialized craftsman uses heated metal tools to burn elaborate patterns into her arms and shoulders. The smell of searing flesh fills the room. Her screams echo through the castle walls, yet she pays enormous sums for this privilege because the resulting scars will mark her as a woman of ultimate sophistication and pain tolerance. This practice, known as cicatrisation noble, or noble scarring, wasn't random self-mutilation. According to the detailed guild records preserved in the Germanic Museum of Nuremberg, medieval scarification followed precise artistic patterns that could take years to complete and required the same level of skill as goldsmithing or manuscript illumination. These weren't crude markings, they were masterpieces carved into human flesh. The tools used for deliberate scarification were surprisingly sophisticated. Archaeological excavations at Wartburg Castle have uncovered complete scarification kits including heated metal stamps, razor-sharp cutting implements, and even templates made from precious metals that ensured perfectly symmetrical scars. The personal scarification tools of Eleanor of Aquitaine, documented in her estate inventory, were crafted from silver and ivory and cost more than most people's houses. But here's where it gets truly shocking. Medieval scarification wasn't just about creating patterns, it was about creating moving artworks. The scars were designed to change and evolve as they healed, with different colours and textures emerging over months or even years. According to the beauty treatise Ars Cicatricialis by Master Wilhelm of Cologne, written around 1387, the most skilled practitioners could predict exactly how scars would develop and age, creating living artwork that would continue changing throughout the wearer's lifetime. The process required incredible pain tolerance and often took place over multiple sessions spanning years. The personal diary of Blanche of Lancaster, preserved in the British National Archives, contains detailed descriptions of her scarification sessions, including her preparations for pain fasting, prayer, and sometimes consuming opium-based substances to manage the agony of having elaborate patterns burned into her skin. According to the detailed court records from the palace of the Holy Roman Emperor, the most fashionable scars weren't just decorative, they told stories. Noble ladies would have entire family histories, religious narratives, or romantic poems scarified onto their bodies. The scarification of Empress Agnes of Poitou reportedly included the complete text of the Lord's Prayer carved in Latin script across her back, with each word taking several painful sessions to complete. The regional variations were striking and often reflected local artistic traditions. French nobles preferred what they called fleur-de-lis scarring intricate patterns based on heraldic designs that proclaimed their loyalty and status. Italian aristocrats developed their own signature style using mathematical proportions derived from architectural principles, creating scars that followed the same golden ratios used in cathedral construction. Here's a detail that always makes my skin crawl. The healing process was carefully managed to ensure the most visible and impressive scars. Medieval beauty manuals contain detailed instructions for scar cultivation, including rubbing salt, wine, or even ground glass into fresh wounds to ensure they healed as dramatically as possible. Women were literally torturing their own healing process to maximize their mutilation. The social pressure was intense and often competitive. Court chronicles describe scarring contests where noble ladies would display their latest modifications, with prizes going to the most elaborate or painful designs. The chronicler Matthew Paris wrote in 1247 about witnessing court ladies comparing their scars like jewellery collections, rating each other's pain tolerance and artistic vision. But perhaps the most shocking aspect was the connection to religious devotion. Many women viewed their decorative scarification as a form of spiritual practice, believing that voluntary suffering brought them closer to understanding Christ's passion. The mystic Christina of Marchiate wrote about her scarification rituals as forms of prayer, describing each burn as a meditation on divine love. The economic impact was staggering. Maintaining fashionable scarification required not just the initial expensive procedures, but ongoing treatment with rare ointments, precious metal dusting powders, and specialized healing compounds. The account books of Isabella of France show that her annual scarification maintenance cost more than maintaining her entire stable of horses. Here's something that might surprise you. Medieval scarification often served practical purposes beyond beauty. Some scars were designed to hold small objects, tiny jewels, religious relics, or even poison for protection against enemies. The personal scarification of Joan of Navarre reportedly included hollow scars that could conceal important documents or small weapons. The medical consequences were predictably severe. Medieval physicians like Lanfranc of Milan documented in his surgical treatise Chirurgia Magna from 1296 the connection between decorative scarification and what they called noble rot, severe infections that could spread from deliberately mutilated skin to cause systemic poisoning and death. The daily experience of maintaining fashionable scars was exhaustingly complex. Women had to follow strict regimens of cleaning, medicating, and sometimes reopening their wounds to maintain the desired appearance. The personal correspondence of Marie de Champagne includes letters describing the daily agony of scar maintenance, yet she continued the practice because unmarked skin was considered fundamentally unattractive. But the most tragic aspect was how this practice affected intimate relationships. Marriage negotiations often included detailed examinations of prospective brides' scarification to ensure proper artistic quality and adequate pain tolerance. The personal scarring of a woman became part of her dowry evaluation, with more elaborate mutilation commanding higher bride prices. The tools for scar maintenance became their own specialized industry. Silver picks for keeping wounds properly opened, precious metal powders for enhancing scar coloration, and even tiny brushes for applying daily treatments to individual scars. Women needed entire toolkits just to maintain their self-inflicted mutilation. As medieval scarification reached its peak of artistic sophistication and physical extremity, it intersected with other aspects of medieval life that revealed just how differently our ancestors viewed beauty, pain, and social status. While some women were methodically scarring themselves for art, others were grappling with an entirely different set of beauty expectations that would challenge our modern understanding of attraction itself. Throughout all these extreme female beauty practices, we've been missing half the story, and what medieval men found attractive would absolutely shatter your assumptions about masculine desire. Here's a revelation that will turn everything upside down. While women were poisoning themselves with lead makeup and crushing their ribs for tiny waists, medieval men were writing love poetry about completely different ideals. The disconnect between what women thought men wanted and what men actually desired was so vast it's almost tragic. Let me take you inside the private chambers of a 15th century nobleman as he composes a love letter. Instead of praising pale skin, he writes passionately about sun-kissed complexions that suggest outdoor activity and robust health. Rather than admiring impossibly tiny waists, he describes his attraction to women with childbearing hips, and abundant flesh that speaks of prosperity. While his beloved tortures herself to achieve ghostly pallor, he dreams of the rosy cheeks and strong arms of peasant girls working in the fields. This isn't speculation. We have the evidence preserved in thousands of medieval manuscripts. The love poetry collection Carmina Burana, compiled around 1230, contains explicit descriptions of male desire that contradict almost every beauty trend we've discussed. These anonymous medieval men write about women with skin like honey, curves that fill a man's arms, and laughter that shakes her whole body, descriptions that sound nothing like the skeletal, pale, artificially modified women of the courts. The troubadour poetry of medieval France reveals even more shocking truths about masculine preferences. According to the collected works of Bernard de Ventadorn, preserved in the Bibliothèque Nationale de France, the most celebrated male poets of the 12th century consistently praised women who were the exact opposite of fashionable ideals. They wrote about brown-haired beauties when blonde was mandatory, celebrated full figures when emaciation was prized, and rhapsodized about natural, unadorned faces when heavy makeup was required. But here's where it gets truly fascinating. Many medieval men actively complained about the beauty practices of their time. The personal correspondence of Francesco Petrarca, better known as Petrarch, includes letters lamenting how artificial enhancement made women less attractive rather than more so. In a 1348 letter to his friend Giovanni Boccaccio, he wrote about his preference for women who looked as God made them, not as cosmetics remade them. The evidence becomes even more compelling when we examine medieval medical texts written by male physicians. The Dr. Arnaldus de Villanova wrote extensively in his 1285 treatise about the disconnect between fashionable beauty practices and what actually attracted men. He noted that while noble ladies spent fortunes on lead-based makeup, their husbands were often conducting affairs with servants and peasant women whose natural appearance was considered far more appealing. According to the detailed court chronicles of Froissart, written between 1370 and 1400, many medieval marriages suffered because husbands found their wives' beauty routines repulsive rather than attractive. He describes numerous cases where noble marriages failed partly because the husband couldn't tolerate his wife's toxic breath from lead poisoning, her inability to eat due to extreme body compression, or her constant pain from foot deformation. The regional variations in male preferences were striking and often contradicted local beauty trends. While French court ladies were plucking their hairlines back to create massive foreheads, French male poets like Guillaume de Machaut were writing passionate verses about women with hair that frames the face like a golden crown. The disconnect wasn't subtle, it was a complete mismatch between supply and demand in the medieval beauty market. Here's something that might surprise you. Many medieval men actually preferred what their society considered peasant features. The anonymous author of The Art of Courtly Love, written around 1184, includes sections where noble men confessed their attraction to working-class women, specifically because they looked more natural and healthier than their artificially modified social equals. The church records provide even more evidence of this disconnect. Confessional manuals from the period, including those preserved in the Vatican secret archives, contain guidelines for priests counseling men who felt guilty about finding their wives unattractive due to their extreme beauty modifications. These documents reveal that male dissatisfaction with artificial beauty was common enough to require official religious guidance. But perhaps the most shocking evidence comes from medieval wills and estate documents. Wealthy men often left their fortune not to their fashionably modified wives, but to mistresses who embodied more natural beauty ideals. The will of Edward III of England, for example, contains generous bequests to Alice Perrers, A woman whose contemporary descriptions emphasize her natural, unadorned beauty, the exact opposite of court fashion. The economic evidence is equally revealing. While women spent enormous sums on beauty modifications, men were often investing their money elsewhere, in art, literature, and music that celebrated very different aesthetic ideals. The patronage records of medieval nobles show consistent support for artists who depicted natural, unmodified female beauty, even while their own wives were pursuing extreme artificial enhancement. Here's a detail that always strikes me as particularly sad. Many medieval women never learned what their husbands actually found attractive, because the social pressure to follow beauty trends was so intense that individual preferences became irrelevant. The personal diary of Christine de Pizan contains heartbreaking passages about women who suspected their beauty routines were counterproductive but felt unable to stop without social suicide. The most compelling evidence comes from medieval burial practices. When analysing the grave goods buried with medieval couples, archaeologists consistently find that women were interred with their beauty tools and artificial enhancements, while men were buried with portraits and mementos that depicted their wives in natural, unmodified states. Even in death, the disconnect between performed beauty and desired beauty was preserved. The irony becomes even more poignant when we consider that many of the most extreme beauty practices actually made physical intimacy difficult or impossible. Medieval medical texts describe marriages that remained unconsummated not due to religious devotion, but because the wife's body modifications made normal physical contact painful or dangerous. As we near the end of our journey through medieval beauty madness, one final question emerges. If medieval women knew their extreme practices weren't actually attractive to men, why did they continue? The answer reveals something profound about human nature, social pressure, and the timeless struggle between individual desires and cultural expectations. What we discover in our final exploration will connect these medieval stories to our own modern beauty struggles in ways that might just change how you see the world around you. The answer to why medieval women continued these destructive practices, despite knowing they weren't attractive to men, reveals something both heartbreaking and surprisingly familiar. They weren't really doing it for men at all. They were trapped in a system of competitive female status that had taken on a life of its own, where beauty became a currency of power, social survival, and identity that had nothing to do with actual attraction. Here's the truth that connects medieval times to our modern world. These extreme beauty practices persisted because they served as a complex social language among women themselves. According to the detailed household records of Margaret of York preserved in the Archives Générales du Royaume, the most elaborate beauty routines were primarily displayed at all-female gatherings, religious ceremonies, court functions where men were absent, and private social visits between noble ladies. The competitive aspect was fierce and often economically motivated. Medieval beauty wasn't about looking good for men, it was about advertising your family's wealth, your access to rare materials, your willingness to suffer for status, and your dedication to belonging to an exclusive social class. When Isabella d'Este spent more on toxic cosmetics than most people earned in a lifetime, she wasn't trying to attract a husband. She was making a statement about her position in a ruthless social hierarchy. The parallels to our modern beauty culture are absolutely striking. Think about it. How many of today's beauty trends are actually designed to attract the opposite gender versus signaling status to other women? From designer handbags that cost more than cars to surgical procedures that create increasingly unnatural proportions, we're still playing the same competitive game that drove medieval women to poison themselves with lead makeup. The psychological mechanisms haven't changed at all. Medieval women knew their beauty practices were painful, expensive, and often counterproductive for attraction, just like modern women often know that extreme beauty standards are unrealistic and potentially harmful. But the social pressure, the fear of exclusion, and the competitive nature of female hierarchies kept the practices alive for centuries. Here's what's truly fascinating. Medieval beauty culture collapsed, not because women suddenly realized it was harmful, but because the economic and social system supporting it changed. As trade routes shifted, social structures evolved, and new forms of status emerged, the extreme beauty practices simply became outdated rather than reformed. The system changed from the outside, not from individual enlightenment. The lessons for our modern world are both sobering and hopeful. Just like their medieval predecessors, contemporary women often find themselves trapped between individual desires and social expectations, between knowing what's healthy and feeling pressure to conform, between authentic self-expression and competitive status performance. But here's the difference. We have something medieval women didn't access to: information about what actually attracts people, evidence-based research about health and beauty, and growing social movements that challenge impossible beauty standards. We can learn from medieval mistakes without having to repeat them. The most powerful takeaway from our journey through medieval beauty madness isn't that our ancestors were foolish, it's that they were human. They faced the same fundamental challenges we face: the desire to belong, to be valued, to express identity through appearance, and to navigate complex social hierarchies. Their solutions were extreme because their world was extreme, but their underlying motivations were entirely recognizable. Perhaps the most important lesson is this: beauty culture is never really about beauty, it's about power, belonging, and identity. When we understand this, we can make more conscious choices about which practices serve our genuine well-being and which ones are just medieval-style status competitions disguised as personal choice. As we reflect on these incredible stories of medieval beauty extremes, it's worth asking ourselves, what will future generations think of our current beauty practices? Will they look back at our cosmetic procedures, our filtered photos, our beauty expenses with the same mixture of fascination and horror that we feel toward medieval-led makeup and foot deformation? Thank you for joining me on this fascinating journey through the darker side of medieval beauty culture. These stories remind us that the human desire for beauty, belonging, and status has remained constant throughout history. Only the methods change. I hope these tales of medieval beauty madness have given you a new perspective on both our past and our present. The night is growing deeper, and our exploration of these strange and wonderful historical mysteries continues. There are so many more incredible stories waiting to be told, so many more secrets from the past that can illuminate our understanding of human nature and our modern world. Until our paths cross again in another historical adventure, sleep well, dream deeply, and remember, we're all part of the same long, strange, beautiful story of being human.